get your head down, get into the right gear, put a podcast on, put some music on, stop regularly for snacks, take lots of photographs, and just kind of wind your way up bit by bit. And it takes as long as it takes.
It's brought us a lot of joy, so it's really a cool thing.
The next morning was when I entered cycling paradise.
And it is probably the hardest thing I've ever done on a bike, and I've done quite a few crazy things.
Welcome to episode 74 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew Sykes. Now, I seem to remember that episode 73, that was only published about, just over a week ago. I seem to remember that I started with an apology that I hadn't published a podcast for many, many weeks. Well, I've got another apology this time, but not an apology to everybody, an apology specifically to Cathryn Ramsden, Dale Majors, Gavin McCulloch and Richard Jeffries, because these are the four people, you've just heard them very briefly, these are the four people who, over the course of the last 6 months, have recorded interviews with, or they've provided me with a monologue about their cycle touring experiences, but much to my shame, I've yet to include in one of the podcasts. So I thought, perfect opportunity, episode 74, put them all together, and it should make, hopefully, for a good podcast. I'm going to start with Cathryn Ramsden. She contacted me last summer. She was listening to the podcasts that I was making when I was cycling around France and then into the Alps and then down the Rhine. And she mentioned that she'd just completed her own cycle tour with her husband and her 12-year-old son. They went from Calais all the way down to Annecy in the Alps. And I thought, this is interesting, because we don't usually feature people who travel with their children. Now, much to my shame, this was actually recorded way back in December of 2022. But it's an interesting story. And if you are in a position where you're thinking of taking your children on a cycle tour, then she's got some good advice. So the first person we're going to listen to is Cathryn Ramsden.
My name is Cathryn Ramsden. I live just outside Marlborough, down in Wiltshire. I'm married. I've got a son called Arthur, who's now 13, and I'm a primary school teacher. My trip was like two weeks with a bonus week at the end of it. So you were going for much longer and further than we were. But yeah, I was listening to your podcast as I was slogging up some of the hills in the Jura, which are not like massive mountains, but when you don't live anywhere near the mountains, they felt pretty massive at the time. And I knew that I could do it physically. I just needed to keep my brain occupied. So I kind of plugged you in on my phone, so it was kind of in my ears. And my husband was like, what are you listening to? Because he's from Yorkshire as well, so he recognised that accent. So I had to explain it. If you go right back to the start, I was doing kind of week-long cycle trips before I met my husband, and then we did some cycle trips together, and which culminated in a month-long trip about in 2008 when we went from Toulouse to Salzburg. So that was like a month. We took off work and did that. So we'd always been into cycle travel and cycle touring. And then we had our son, and then everything kind of came to a grinding halt because it's just so much hard work with the baby. And then we ended up moving to California for 7 years, and cycling took a backseat and running became the thing that I wanted to do. And then we moved back to the UK. And Arthur had grown up a bit and was like super strong and super sporty. So last year we did the King Alfred Way with him, and he loved that. And this year I thought we might do something a little bit more ambitious. So Annecy is like my favourite place in the entire world. I'd kind of heard about it in advance and thought, yeah, that sounds absolutely perfect. It looks perfect. And then when I actually got there, it must have been just before the pandemic, about 2019, I was just blown away. I mean, it's just perfect. I don't know if you've been, but it's like this mountainous lake, and there's mountains all around it, and the sun glitters on it, and the old town is beautiful, and it's just heaven. I just love it. So I've been obsessed with it ever since. And then during the 2021 lockdown, the really nasty winter one that we had, I needed a bit of motivation to do any exercise, because otherwise I was just going to sit on my bottom and eat carbs for the whole of the lockdown. So I set myself this kind of virtual challenge. So I set up a spreadsheet and logged all of the bike rides that I was doing, every 5 miles, 10 miles. I wasn't doing anything very far. And at the same time, I plotted the route from Calais to Annecy and worked out how far it would be. And so each day, or each time I did my bike ride, I would work out how many miles I'd done on that kind of journey, and then go onto Google Maps and look at what I'd be looking at if I was at that spot on in real life. And it all sounds a bit contrived, and it probably was a bit contrived, to be honest, but there wasn't much joy in those days, was there? And it did bring me an awful lot of joy and a lot of pleasure, and it kind of got me out of the house and made miles and exercise a bit more meaningful than just getting out of the house for an hour a day, because that's what I was allowed. And it felt like I was working towards something when there was really not that much to work towards at that particular time. So it kind of was this lockdown dream, something that I did to keep myself entertained. Then I was like, well, now I have to go and do it in real life, don't I? It was so much fun doing it. I thought I have to make that happen. I was born with a hole in my heart and a leaking aortic valve. And then when I was 3, back in the darkest 70s, I had heart surgery in the Royal Brompton Hospital, which is an amazing hospital. And ever since then, I've been incredibly lucky and incredibly healthy. So I have this heart condition, but it's monitored. I don't need to take any medication. I've lived a fairly normal life, and I've been able to do kind of sporting wise as much as I've ever really wanted to do sporting wise. But at some point, I know that I will have to have an aortic valve replacement, because mine is, plugging along and probably need replacing. But as I said, I've been super healthy. And then in about the March of this year, I was having my phone consultation with my cardiologist. And he just kind of casually dropped into conversation, well, yeah, we should probably think about doing your valve replacement surgery sooner rather than later. And I just kind of froze. And I was like, well, why? And he's like, well, you're not getting any younger, and, we don't want to do it while you're older, and we don't want to do it when it's really urgent. We want to do it when in a really controlled, calm environment. So it's probably time to think about it soon. And, honestly, that kind of freaked me out a little bit. I was like, well, I don't want to. I feel fine. But what it did do, and still does really, was make me think, it's like, I didn't know how many summers I would have left as healthy as I am now, if that makes sense. It's like, I have no idea what it will be like when I've had valve replacement surgery. I might be absolutely fine. I might be really fast, and I might be able to go and do a marathon. I don't know what I can do. But I also might not be able to. I might suffer. I might be ill. I might have to take medication. They may not let me go and cycle and do stuff that I love doing. So it just became this real reminder that we don't know what we've got coming up. We don't know how many summers we've got. And I just really knew that I did not want to be lying there feeling horrible with a pipe down my throat after surgery, having not done this, having not cycled to Annecy. It was like, that's one of the things that I just want to make sure I've done in case I can never do it again. I mean, I'm sure I can, but it was just something I wanted to guarantee that I had done. So yeah, that was quite a motivator, that was. So initially I wanted to do it by myself. I think when you have, don't let my mum listen to this, but when you have like a lifelong heart condition or a lifelong illness of some type, you kind of feel you need to prove something all the time. So, you need to prove to your doctors that, look how fit I am, and prove to your mum, look how fine I am. And, I'm way too old to still be proving stuff, but I am definitely still feel that need to prove to myself maybe, or to other people, that I can do stuff. So initially I wanted to do it on my own, because I've not done much touring on my own, and I have really enjoyed it. So I had this conversation with my husband. I was like, this is what I'm thinking about doing. And I quite fancy doing it on my own. And Rich was amazing. He was like, well, no, it's like, we want to do it with you. We'll do it as a family. It will be a family adventure, which was the sweetest, loveliest thing. And I was really touched, actually. So we called Arthur in, and he'd done the King Arthur Way with us last year. And we knew that he was ridiculously strong and fit. Like physically, we weren't at all worried about him, but we weren't sure whether he would want to, whether he would have the kind of the mental strength, particularly for those long climbs which go on for an hour or so. I didn't know what he had in him. So we said to him, this is what we're thinking about doing. What do you think? He was like, well, yeah, I really want to do it, but I definitely need a new bike. So we had to go and get him a new bike. So that was very, very clever. I was quite admiring. So he had a mountain bike. He still has a mountain bike. But we got him a secondhand gravel bike for the ride. So that was kind of the motivating factor for a 12-year-old at the time. He's really strong and fit. He does loads of sport. And having watched him fly around the King Alfred Way with 2 aging parents like trailing in his wake, we knew that physically he was strong enough. We definitely wanted it to be child friendly. So instead of camping, and actually Richard wasn't keen on camping either, so we definitely didn't camp. We stayed in cheap hotels, Airbnbs, whatever we could find at the time. I then looked at the route that I had planned and made sure that it was suitable. So we kind of front loaded the mileage. For the first 8-9 days we were doing quite long miles, like 55-60 miles a day, but it was pretty flat and I knew he could just poodle along there. When we hit the Jura, we had 100 miles roughly of hilly stroke mountainous distance. So instead of doing that over 2 days, I split that into 3 days so that we didn't have to worry about distance and climbing. So we could just take it a little bit more steadily and a bit more carefully. And then we planned rest days every 4 days, which I thought would be suitable for 12-year-olds. But actually it was suitable for 48-year-olds as well. It was really nice just doing 4 days and then having a day off. So that worked out really well. So yeah, I changed the way we did it to make it child friendly, but it actually made it more pleasurable, I think, for the adults as well. We're not trying to prove, we're not trying to go super fast. We're not in a race. We're on holiday, cycling through France, eating baguette. If I'd done it by myself, I probably would have camped. Richard likes camping, but doesn't like cycling all day and then camping. He wants to cycle all day and then have a hot shower and a comfy bed and go to sleep, and that's fine. So no, if I'd taken Rich, no, definitely wouldn't have camped. If it had been just me and Arthur, potentially, yeah, I think he would have been probably up for more of it. But we were honestly very happy to get to a nice little hotel and have a hot shower and a comfy bed every night. It wasn't a hardship at all. Just made it a bit expensive, but it was a one-off really in terms of that level of investment. It was planned to death, which is probably one of my failings, but I enjoy the planning as much as the doing, to be honest. And so I had my route planned out. I had like a rough spreadsheet of which day, where we start, where we finish, how many miles it is, that kind of thing. And then back in March, I got COVID finally. And I was very lucky. I wasn't too poorly. So I spent my days languishing in bed, like booking hotels, which was a really good use of COVID. So yeah, we were all booked up. The downside was that you then needed to make sure you got to that destination. But the other thing I did was every day I investigated if something went wrong, how could we get there? Did we need a taxi? Was there a bus? Was there a train? So we always had a plan B just in case something went wrong. And we were pretty chilled about taking it. If we needed that plan B, we would take it, and we weren't purists about it. I don't know if you remember, just after the school holidays ended, Dover became absolutely swamped and there were queues for hours and people were missing everything. So we were a little bit nervous that it would happen to us as well. But by the time we got there, it was absolutely fine. So my dad drove us, dropped us off, and then we kind of cycled onto the ferry, which was a load of fun. And yeah, got ourselves to Calais. And Calais was a really nice surprise. I was really pleasantly surprised by Calais. The tour had just come through when we got there. It was about a week after the tour had come through. So I think there was a lot of stuff for that. But we were just like blown away by the beach. It's like we lived in San Francisco for 7 years. And if you kind of squinted really hard, it kind of reminded us a lot of the Californian beaches. And they clearly played into that. There were lots of postcards around saying like California, which we thought was hilarious. And they were like, they'd invested in like fitness equipment along the seafront, and there were like shirtless dudes playing beach volleyball, and it was just so much nicer than we'd expected. It was a really good start to our trip actually, Calais. So I used a website called cycle.travel, which it's quite well known. I really like it. I've tested it, locally, and the roads that they send me on are the roads that I would have taken with my local knowledge. So I planned it on that and pretty much followed that to the letter. We did a bit of Eurovelo here and there, but just kind of stretches here and stretches there. We weren't following anything for any long distance. There was a lot of cycling along canals and the waterways, which was brilliant, actually. It just felt so safe taking Arthur deep into France. We must have done hundreds of miles barely on a road, just using canal towpaths and waterway towpaths. And I was really grateful for that. So there was a lot of that. And then, they would kick us off now and again onto little lanes that went through little villages. And it was a beautiful route. The only day that I didn't like was the last day, actually, from Calais, from Annecy to Geneva, because we flew home from Geneva. And I used Komoot to plan that day. And with no disrespect to Komoot, because I think it's excellent, the planning there wasn't as good as the other days had been. So I probably would redo that. If I was going to do that ride again, I would do a different route. But on the whole, it was a great route. It was harder than we'd expected, but also in some respects easier, if that makes sense, because we knew they'd be mountains, and then in your head, you're like going up the Alp, going up the Alp, aren't you? And on the whole, it's not that bad. We just found that we had to get ourselves into that mindset that we were going to be doing this for a couple of hours now, because we're not speedy, and just get your head down, get into the right gear, put a podcast on, put some music on, stop regularly for snacks, take lots of photographs, and just kind of wind your way up bit by bit. And it takes as long as it takes. We got better at leaving early in the morning because we were there when it was unbelievably hot. We had a couple of almost unbearably hot days. So we got better at leaving early so that we weren't climbing in the heat of the day. Actually, no, it was pretty decent. But yeah, we did cycle up to a ski resort where they had like lifts and things like that, and we were really proud of ourselves. Cycling up to a ski resort is quite impressive for people who live in Wiltshire, I thought. I mean, I know I'm biased because I'm his mum, but he is an amazingly strong boy, to the point where, so we had our panniers each, and then I had a handlebar bag. Can't remember if they did. I had a handlebar bag, and then we had like a rack bag on the back of mine that had the day's food in, and it had the tools on the lock that we took, some of the heavier bits and bobs that we needed. And by day 2, I was like, this is ridiculous. My child is flying up those hills and I'm like slogging along. So I took it off and put the rack bag on Arthur's bike, and he moaned and groaned, but he still didn't slow down at all. He still got to the top of everything before we did. So no, he was amazing. He had a really good attitude. We had one day, as you always do, when kind of everything went wrong, and he fell off, and that was fine. Richard fixed his bike. I mopped him up. That was fine. And then we stopped in a cafe, and he was kind of stood astride his bike, and because the panniers on the back were, make it slightly unstable, his bike fell and his chainring cut his leg quite badly. So there was blood everywhere, and that was quite exciting. And that was when the gaps in my first aid kit became very apparent, because I didn't have anything at all that was suitable. That was quite embarrassing. And so I was a little bit worried about him that day, but he was fine. He was flying along. So no, if anything, it was me and Richard that he needed to worry about, not the other way around. I don't know what his friend said. I know that every adult that we spoke to was blown away by him. And he got a lot of accolades from, other grown-ups that we talked to who couldn't imagine doing it themselves, let alone doing it when they were 12. But his friends do seem to take everything in their stride. They're kind of just quite nonchalant about everything. And so, no, he didn't tell me that anyone was particularly staggered about it, but all the grown-ups were. Yeah, we had some plans for next year, but they've kind of fallen through a little bit. But I have some secret plans that I haven't shared with my poor husband yet about what I want to do next year. But Arthur has already said that he would like to do another bike trip. Richard was keen that we walked the Pennine Way as a family, and Arthur and I nearly died at that prospect. Like spending our precious summer walking through the north of England, it's like, no. And Arthur was like, no, I want to go cycling. So I thought that boded well. I do kind of cherish the idea that he might go off and do that himself when he's a little bit older, when he's kind of 18, 19, and takes his bike, takes all of our kit, heads off around Europe for a little bit. I hope that it's planted that idea in him, that it's something that actually isn't that difficult. Everyone said, oh my word, I can never do that. But you know what it's like. You just start early, you go slowly, and bit by bit you get there and you eat a lot of food, and then you rest for the day, and then you do it again the next day. It's not a particularly hard thing, cycle touring. And it is a lovely thing to do, a lovely way of spending a couple of weeks. It was literally as good as I dreamed it would be. It was everything that I dreamed it would be. And I think having Richard and Arthur with me as well just made it even better. I love France. And France was gorgeous. The food was gorgeous. The weather was gorgeous. I love it when it's hot. The countryside was gorgeous. The whole thing was just lovely. It was just 2 really, really special weeks traveling, and then we had a week in Annecy before we got the flight back, and I could just stay there forever, so that was pretty heavenly as well. It was a really, really good summer. I would pack my first aid kit much better. I would probably reroute that last day from Annecy to Geneva, but on the whole, no, there's not much that I would change. It worked out really well. I packed too many clothes, of course I did. I think it's hard when you're traveling, and then when you're somewhere for a week afterwards, you've got like holiday clothes as well as cycling clothes. And being in France, you don't want to look really, really unattractive because you're in France, so you want to look decent. So I probably packed too many kind of hanging out in Annecy clothes. But that was pretty much it. It was just lovely.
So that's how Cathryn Ramsden got on in the summer of 2022. Now, she did mention plans for 2023, and she did reveal what her plans were at the end of the interview. Here's what she said.
The doors are closed. So the secret plan is the Women's Tour de France starts just after term ends. So what I'm secretly planning is that we go out to the Pyrenees, because I've never been to the Pyrenees, and potentially like base ourselves somewhere and do day rides rather than an actual tour, or like start somewhere and go somewhere. But I really want to go and watch the Women's Tour. But I haven't mentioned this to Rich yet. But I've never been to the Pyrenees at all. We always go to the Alps. So I think that would be quite fun.
So the question is that what she's going to be doing in the summer of 2023? The answer is no, she isn't. I contacted her yesterday and she said, no, the plans have changed. They're going to fly to Geneva on Tuesday of next week, and they're going to cycle over the Alps to Rome because her son, Arthur, has recently seen the film Gladiator, and that has inspired them to do something slightly different. So thank you to Cathryn. You can presumably follow her progress. She'll be tweeting about it if you go to Cathryn Ramsden on Twitter. That's Cathryn, Cathryn, Ramsden, Ramsden. And good luck to her husband and her son on their cycle through Italy. Now, the second person we're going to hear from, also recorded at the back end of 2022, so my apologies to the person concerned, is Dale Majors. He lives in Utah in the United States, and he also travels with his family, but he takes the whole thing to a whole new level. He doesn't just have one child and his partner, his wife. He travels with 6 children, and he explained and he talked about the logistics of doing something like that when I spoke to him last year.
My name is Dale Majors, and I am a father entrepreneur from Salt Lake City, Utah, and we love bicycle touring with our kids. Right out of high school, my friends and I thought, bike touring is a thing. We can get our tents and pannier bags and go on a quick bike tour. So we took the bus from Salt Lake City to California, Santa Barbara, California, and we rode our bikes about 250 miles down to San Diego. It was amazing. After that, we said, well, hey, let's go to Europe. And we were available. We flew to Amsterdam. And then from Amsterdam, we used a road map. We didn't know about Eurovelo back then, and I don't know where it was in its growth, but we mostly just used street maps. We rode from Amsterdam to Hoek van Holland and over to Harwich. We rode to London, and then we rode down to Dover, went back to Dunkirk, and then we rode to Brussels, and then Paris, and then Geneva, and then Nice, and then down to Barcelona. We took a train to Pamplona, and then we rode from Pamplona to Bragança, Portugal, and down to Porto, Portugal, and then down to Lisbon. We never stayed in a hostel. We wild camped maybe 40 or 50% of the time, and then we stayed in campsites the other half. So we've done the Loire twice. The first time we did it with a 1, 3, and 5-year-old. The second time we did it 2, 4, 6, 8. We flew to Paris both times. One of the times we took our bikes with us. The other time we put them on a boat. We palletized them on a wood pallet, all the boxes, and we sent it on a boat 6 weeks ahead of time. The worst part of all of this is making sure you have all your stuff to send over and then packaging all your stuff to send back. They dropped our bikes off at the campsite in Bois de Boulogne. I've camped several times in Paris, camping near the Eiffel Tower, a beautiful, easy place to camp. And a big truck came and dropped off our bikes there, and we just unpacked them all. We usually unpack our bikes at the airport, and we prepare for the day. The first time we set everything up in the Paris airport, and then we rode out of the airport, which is also kind of terrible because the traffic, we don't know how we're going to do it this time. My wife is a big part of what we do, and logistically, she does more of the prep work. There are so many things with a trip like this, even in the planning, you just have to hope that a lot of the stuff just comes together. In our case, 1 tent for 8 people. We've never been turned away from a campsite. We've wild camped before too. With food, especially, last summer we rode along the Katy Trail in Missouri, along the Missouri River, 220 miles. We got down to granola and Nutella and a few different heat up meals We carry a lot of food. We carry extra food for probably 2 days, and we're restocking constantly. Having access to grocery stores along a route is a really important thing for us without having to go too far away. The first three, do a pretty good job at doing their things, and they all have their own panniers and they pack their own bikes. And out of necessity, we do a pretty good job. But if you asked my wife in a very honest moment, sometimes she would just say, oh, it's chaos. And we don't want to be that family that's crazy and all over the place. So she's pretty sensitive to that. So we sure try to have them, helping in line. And what's good is there's so much to do that they all can kind of chip in. We had a long ride in Pennsylvania along the Great Allegheny Passage Trail last summer, and it was raining, and we were still out in 2 hours. You don't love putting your gear away soaked, but it is what it is, and you have to get over some of those details. When you have so many things going, like some of the preferences that you might have as a solo tourist kind of have to go out the window. I toured with an uncle, and he's like, nope, we're going to dry out the tent. And I'm like, well, good luck, because sometimes you're going to be touring for, a week in the rain. If we hurry, it still takes 2 hours. It's hard. Hopefully we can figure it out to go more quickly. But when you're feeding everybody and having everybody load up their bikes, and it just takes time. Even blowing up and putting away 8 sleeping pads, takes time. There's a whole other level of logistics to get to restaurants on time, to find good food, to not eat kebabs and fries all the time. From a budget standpoint, it makes it possible for us to go and travel for, this summer we should be gone for 3 months. And if we were buying food all the time, the budget would go crazy. We stop at all the castles. We do take a good bit of sightseeing. We stop at every park. We try to ride 60%, 65% of our miles before lunch. And then we have a good lunch break, and then we'll finish it off after. We use the Michelin maps, the Eurovelo 6. I believe they're Michelin. We'll know typically 1-2 days ahead. We always know where we're staying. We plotted out, added up all the mileage the night before. We say, okay, add up all the kilometers. Do we want to go 27 miles tomorrow? Yes, great. That's going to be the campsite. If we feel good and want to do 5 more, then we'll do that. But that'll be the conversation we have the day before. Because we're traveling with kids, we're reminding ourselves all the time, like, what is best for the kids and family collectively, and how many miles should we do. So we plan every night. Our kids are all young enough to not keep quiet about things for the sake of family harmony. We know how everything's going all the time. And I think a lot of times, to my detriment, I'm more of the fun dad. They're fine talking back to me. My wife is a little more of the order in the home. So they're pretty open about their feelings. All of the ones that are old enough to vocalize and talk about it are excited to go on these trips. Yeah, let's go on a bike tour again. It's amazing looking back. Oh, such an amazing tour. But when you're in it, it's more like, I think they call it type 2 fun. Maybe kind of fun and enjoyable while you're in it, but even more so when you're done. But the kids, they feel accomplished. And I read a quote from the Benjamin Franklin biography 2 weeks ago that said something to the tone of, when men are employed in a labor, when they're busy, they're a lot happier, they complain a lot less, things just go better. And we found that with kids. I almost think they're like racehorses. They need to be run. They need to exhaust their energy. And so instead of fighting with each other, they can get their energy out on the trail. And there's a lot of pretty good family harmony on those trips because of that, I think. I know that my friends are like, Dale, that's crazy. You did what? I could never do that. And I'm like, no, it's pretty cool. And maybe you could. On these trips, I've also realized, for the first 10 years of doing this, I thought, I'm really lucky and blessed to be able to do this with my life. And on the last trip, I thought, Most people would not want to would not want to do this. They wouldn't choose to do it. So I really lucked out with marrying someone who also enjoys doing these types of tours. And people see us on the trail, other cyclists, older couples, and they'll be like, you are so lucky that you both, it's amazing that you're doing this, but you're so lucky that you both want to be doing this. Like, wow, how rare. Yeah, most of my friends, though, they think it's really cool, but also like maybe a bit out of reach. This summer, we are leaving a month before school gets out, and we're coming back likely before school starts, but there's a potential that we would stay another month or two. We're still figuring out our route, but we would absolutely consider taking them out and having that experience with them if we have the window. I probably wouldn't do it every year, but hey, every fifth year and a couple of the kids had it, happen. We go on some epic family together trip, 100%. I would do that. We want to be able to ride for about 1,500 miles, 1,500 to 2,000 miles. And we're thinking of going reverse from the Santiago de Compostela, the Camino de Santiago, reverse, and then around, up Bayonne, Biarritz, and then up to maybe the Eurovelo 6 to Nantes, or to Saint-Nazaire, Nantes, and then go across and maybe train to the Rhine. And then from the Rhine, do the Eurovelo 15 to Amsterdam, and then look at going up to Sweden. I'm half Swedish, and I've never been, and I would like to spend some time there. So we can't have too many roads with a 6-year-old, with a 7-year-old cycling. Someday we want to write a book about cycle touring with kids, but for now we just have a Google Doc that has pictures and a picture, principle, explanation, where we're just compiling all of our opinions and findings on traveling with bike touring with children. So if people email me at dale@ventureanyway.com, I'd be happy to send that document to people. I've shared it quite a bit and want to get other people's feedback too. If I can be a support to people that want to travel with kids, I would love for people to reach out to me. It's brought us a lot of joy, so it's really a cool thing.
So there you go. If you want to travel with 6 kids, then get in contact with Dale. His website is ventureanyway.com. Now, next up is Gavin McCulloch. And he got in contact a few weeks ago, in fact, after having listened to episode 72 of the podcast, which featured Greg Yeoman. Greg had cycled to Russia, to Moscow, back in the early 1990s. And Gavin had done a similar kind of thing a bit earlier than Greg, and he recorded a monologue that talked about his experiences of cycling, not just to Moscow in 1990, but other places as well. So without further ado, over to you, Gavin.
Hello, my name is Gavin McCulloch, and I've been enjoying the Cycling Europe podcasts and following a few of the recent podcasts, which kind of rhymed with my experiences. I got in touch with Andrew Sykes, and he kindly asked me to put together this monologue. So the first episode that I listened to was episode 64, which was Laura Massey-Poo, who was recounting her story of cycling around the world in her tandem, and how one of the earliest things she did on the tandems was to cycle up Mont Ventoux. And that certainly made me chuckle, because I have also cycled up Mont Ventoux in a tandem, and it is probably the hardest thing I've ever done on a bike, and I've done quite a few crazy things. So that certainly made me laugh and hooked me into the podcast. And then I came across episode 68 and 69, which were recounts of cycling trips to Athens. And I also have cycled to Athens. I cycled from Scotland via Scandinavia down through Central Europe. Had an absolutely wonderful trip in 2016. Episode 71 was interesting. Mark Wedgwood recounting his story of cycling through all the OS maps in the UK. I have done a similarly obsessive compulsive disorder thing in that I have ridden every road on a number of Ordnance Survey Land Rangers maps. 27 Nairn, 97 Kendal, map 100 Moulton in North Yorkshire. I might say that a friend of mine was the first to the party, having ridden every road on the Edinburgh map. There's probably a whole podcast just in that, so I'm not going to go into any more detail. But it was podcast 72 where Greg Yeoman recounted the story of cycling through Russia in 1993 that really caught my attention, because I also cycled with a friend of mine, John Lindsay, to Moscow in the Soviet Union in 1990. And there was certainly some parallels between Greg Yeoman's trip and ours, in as much as how we encountered the country and the sort of some of the austerity and the great huge big state farms that we cycled through. But there was also some significant differences. One key difference, by the signs of it, was getting permission to do the trip in the first place. So in 1990, things were very different in the Soviet Union as it was at the time, and across the whole of Central Europe. Indeed, you simply couldn't just get permission to go into the Soviet Union without really being on a state-sponsored holiday. There was a state holiday department, I suppose they'd call themselves, called Intourist. They ran things like coach trips around St. Petersburg or Moscow or into the Russian countryside. But they certainly didn't cater for a couple of young Scottish cyclists wanting to find their own way through Russia. So that was the biggest difference I think with Greg's trip. It was getting the permission in the first place, and to do so, we got in touch with the Cyclist Touring Club and the CTC, now Cycling UK, who gave us a contact in Moscow, a chap called Igor Nalimov, who was the president of the Russian Cycling Club. And he assisted us in getting permission pretty much by setting up a travel company and making a bespoke trip for us, which allowed us to get a visa. But that whole process took almost 2 years. It involved multiple facsimiles going back and forward, letters going back and forward with all the inevitable delays and letters going missing, translation problems because neither John nor I spoke Russian. But we did finally get the permission. It came through, and that allows us to plan the rest of the trip. Just to give you a sort of flavour of how things were at the time, the Soviet Union was still communist. That wasn't to change until later in 1991. Poland had gone through its revolutionary process. Communism had fallen in Poland. In Germany, the Berlin Wall had fallen, but the East and West Germany hadn't gone through its unification process. And that actually happened shortly after our trip. Really, very shortly after our trip, in fact. So I must add, why we were planning to cycle to Moscow anyway. At the time, John and I were students, and it was a boozy night in the pub, and one thing led to another. I was looking for a challenge on a bike. I'd done some cycle tours in the north of Scotland as a teenager, and John and I had cycled around Ireland. But I was looking for something kind of bigger, and one of my pals in the pub coined the idea of cycling to Moscow. Now, that was ludicrous at the time. We were involved in the Cold War. The idea of going to what would be considered quite a hostile state just would be absolutely alien to anybody. But there was the idea really caught my imagination, and I couldn't let go of it. and hence why we spent so much time trying to get the permission, which was great when we finally did get it. So we settled on a route which we planned on an atlas, roughly 100 miles a day, which equated about 2 centimetres on my atlas, as I remember. The route was to take us from Moscow, which is a tiny little village in Ayrshire in Scotland, over to Edinburgh, down through Newcastle to Hull, on the ferry over to the Netherlands, through the Netherlands into West Germany, then into East Germany, and then into Berlin, where you at the time went back into West Germany or West Berlin, and then back into East Germany, up to the border with Poland, through Poland to the Soviet Empire, so Belarus and then Russia. And the plan was to stop at Red Square. So it was a pretty significant undertaking, really. We hadn't done anything like that before. I had hardly been out of the United Kingdom. It was an absolutely fabulous trip to see the transition of Europe at that very pivotal time in geopolitics. It really came home to us when we left West Germany and entered East Germany, and the roads were absolutely horrific. It was pretty run down. There was a little bit of difficulty getting food at the time. It wasn't too bad. There was a lot worse to come. When we got into Russia, there was great problems getting food at times. You'd go into a supermarket and it would have rows and rows of massive jars of beetroot, for instance, but there may be nothing else. So as part of our visa to get into the Soviet Union, everything had to be pre-organised. So all accommodation was pre-organised, and Igor followed us in his car, or in a car. He was always at quite a discreet distance. We didn't feel like we were being monitored in any other way. It's quite possible we were, but I think because it was a legitimate sort of trip that had been organised, that would been unlikely, I think, if we had been monitored, but one never really knows. We certainly found the Russian roads to be pretty horrific. Just like Greg, we took military maps, which we hid in our panniers, because we weren't sure quite about how legitimate it would be to have military maps with us. But we did find a pretty smashed up kind of road infrastructure. You know, sometimes it was just kind of mud tracks we found ourselves on. We frequently got lost. But it was absolutely fabulous experience. There was one night we stopped at campings, and I was talking to a Russian chap, a long and interesting conversation we had. And I recall him at the end of the conversation turning around and saying how delighted he was to see us cycling along the main highway up to Moscow from the west, because he considered it as a bond of peace between the west and the east. And that really stayed with me, that comment. And it was a wonderful thing to hear, because, you know, we were just a couple of cyclists, you know. I must add that we're actually joined by a third cyclist, a chap called Mark Muzal, who's an American cyclist. He met us in the Netherlands where he was living, and he was great to have along. He was great value, good fun. But we had a very lightweight approach to touring, not quite cutting down our toothbrushes, but almost. Mark had everything imaginable. His bike was festooned with equipment. I think he had a dictaphone, he had bells, he had about 6 panniers. And as time went on through the trip, more and more stuff got jettisoned and sent back. But it was great to also have him along. In the middle of the trip, I turned 21 years old in a town called Smolensk. And, you know, we went out seeking a couple of beers, you know, to celebrate. And we just couldn't find any. Gorbachev had clamped down pretty heavily to stamp out the alcoholism that was taking over the nation. So we settled on having double helpings of ice cream, which were bought with US dollars, which we had smuggled into the country in our handlebars. Of course, you were never meant to use hard currency in Russia, but it seemed like a sensible precaution just in case we ever did get into trouble, needed to buy a way out of trouble. But in this case, we just used the money to buy ice cream. When we arrived in the outskirts of Moscow, we were greeted by a large group of Russian cyclists and a police escort, and we were driven into Moscow from the ring road and down the centre of the road, right into Red Square. So it was really quite a special ending to the trip. So yeah, things have changed dramatically, of course, in the intervening years, but it's a great shame, of course, now that Western cyclists can't visit Russia. So let's just hope that there's a new bond of peace forms between the West and the East, and the current difficulties can be resolved, and so that cyclists can return. Thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to future Cycling Europe podcasts to see if there's synergies with other crazy things that I've done myself on a bike. And if Andrew thinks of extending the podcast from Cycling Europe to the cycling world, then I'm just back from cycling around New Zealand, both the North Island and the South Island, and it'd be great to hear other travellers' tales from cycling around other far-flung places in the world. Thanks again. Safe cycling, everyone.
Thank you to Gavin McCulloch for recording that. I suspect he might be back to talk about something else in the future, but watch this space. Now, before I get to the final person, who is Richard Jeffries, just a reminder that if you'd like to get in contact with the podcast yourself, you can do so by visiting cyclingeurope.org/contact. And if you do get in contact, and if we do end up recording something, or you recording a monologue, something like that, then I guarantee you won't have to wait 6 months, which is what some of the people who've contributed to this particular episode have had to do. My apologies. Now, you can also support the podcast by visiting cyclingeurope.org/support. There are costs involved, and if you'd like to contribute financially, that would be fantastic. If you'd like to contribute and support the podcast by simply giving a rating or a review on the site where you happen to be listening to this on, excellent, thank you. The final person we're going to hear from is Richard Jeffries. Now, Richard actually listened to episode 70 of the podcast, and in episode 70, I actually read out the first part of my first book, Crossing Europe, and that was way back in 2010, although I recorded it only a few months ago. Now, at the time, I did say that I would continue to record extracts from the book, and I haven't done part 2 yet. Perhaps that's a project that I need to get stuck into while I'm on holiday over the summer. So perhaps that, in fact, might be the next episode, me reading from the next section of that first book, Crossing Europe. But anyway, in the monologue that you're about to hear, Richard Jeffries, talks about his own experiences of cycling, as I did back in 2010, into France and then through Belgium. In his case, he was heading in the direction of the Rhine, and this is what he had to say.
It's 6 a.m. in early April 2022, and I'm on the top of the cliffs of Dover wearing shorts. These aren't the white cliffs of Dover. Today, before dawn, they are the dark cliffs of Dover, and it's windy and it's cold. I'm about to cycle along what most people would see as a motorway down into the busiest port in Europe, at which, according to the BBC News, there is a major incident with people waiting days for a ferry. An hour ago, I was warm in bed, snuggled up to my wife, so naturally enough a part of me thinks, what on earth am I doing here? And another part of me thinks, here we go. It was as I was listening to Andrew's reading of his book about cycling the Eurovelo route of Frankie Jenner earlier today that I figured I'd record this. I was piqued by his decision to avoid what I think he called kinky Brussels. A few weeks ago, I'd done the same thing. I'd toured through France and Belgium and Germany on my bike and could have gone via Brussels. I chose not to. And then I did. This little podcast snippet is about such things, the choices you don't make, but then you do, the hard bits that turn out to be fun, the ups and the downs. I've learned a lot from cycle touring. I've learned that working hard, going uphill, against a headwind, in bad conditions is difficult, but the effort then usually pays off. You feel the benefit, whether that's a wonderful view or a whooping descent that puts a smile on your face and memories that linger for years, or just a sense of satisfaction. The ups are a bit of a downer, but the downs can definitely pick you up again, a bit like life at times. And I'm a keen listener to the Cycling Europe podcast, and I'm often interested to hear from people who are planning a trip and what they're thinking of taking and what's on their mind, particularly before they go, because some people make bike touring seem effortless. They say, "Oh, I took the ferry and I rode from here to there across the continent and it was fun," but not so much for me. Before my recent tour, which was just a week long, so not exactly a world-spanning epic, the idea of heading off on my bike almost felt overwhelming. For weeks before I'd left, I'd found it hard to think about much else, which isn't ideal. I have 2 lovely kids to be a dad to. I work full-time, and I have a list of home jobs longer than I care to think about. So adding on the hours I needed to sort out my bike, finding all the cycling gear, fishing out all the perished camping kit, failing to book ferries, failing to work out a route, and failing to work out where I'd stay was a lot. It felt like too much. And the night before I left, I remember lying awake and thinking, this is all very stressful. I'm nervous and worried and excited, and I still don't know where I'll be sleeping in 24 hours. I have to wake up in just a couple of hours for the ferry, and I haven't even tried my bar bag yet, a new one I just bought yesterday. Maybe I'll just stay at home with my family. Much nicer and easier, surely. But my wife, who understands me very well, and who had certainly had enough of me mooning about distractedly at home, staring at maps and cursing as I tried to work out where I'd put some important piece of my bicycle, said, "Go. Now is a good time. You'll enjoy it." And she was right. Because while staying at home would have been easier, and certainly at times much nicer than the southern side of Lille, staying at home would have been the wrong choice, because the trip left me, as all my bike tours have done, feeling brilliant, physically, emotionally and spiritually. My plan was to reach Germany in the Rhine Valley, south of Cologne. I'd last toured along this bit of the Rhine in late 2009 with my wife, and we'd loved it. I'm also a river scientist. A geomorphologist is the technical term, so I was interested to see some of the rivers. Plus, I remembered a bit from a book by John Hillaby about his journey through Europe, where he walked through the high fans, or high fangs, which sounded just fantastic. And if you look at a map, the route seems simple. Take the ferry to Calais and just ride east, no problem. But not so simple. The problem was time, or not enough time. I had a week, and when you have a young family, being given a week to go off on your own is a major gift. But it wasn't enough to go where I wanted. It's about 300 miles from Calais to Cologne. Even when I was in my 20s, I couldn't ride there and back in a week, and today I'd be doing well if I averaged 50 miles a day. At that rate, it would take me most of the week just to get there, never mind getting back. And the Eurovelo bike route, the one that goes from Calais in that direction, the Frankie Jenner, wasn't that helpful. It really took a lovely route, nice and quiet, along canals and through forests via Brussels, and it added about another 100 or more miles, which is why I decided to ignore it, not go via Belgium and Brussels really at all, and find my own route. Add on to the fact that I love France for cycling, food, how beautiful it is, how wonderful it is for cycling, and that I haven't been there for years, and I just ignored Brussels and the kink and went due east. But one of the best things about bike touring is that it can challenge your prejudices. And one prejudice I broke nicely on this trip was my antipathy towards Belgium, because I found that it isn't only home to excellent beer and chocolate, but also to superb bike routes and cheap, bike-friendly trains. So I'm not sure what the Belgian equivalent of a Francophile is, but I'm now one of those, whatever it may be. Anyway, that's enough of a preamble. Here's how the trip actually went. The start didn't begin well. Having been dropped off at the dark cliffs of Dover, I had to get down to the port. I freewheeled down the A2, the Jubilee Way, where I was not very jubilant at all. My bike had developed a weird shimmy and the new bar bag tried to jump off the front, and I nearly came a cropper. I stopped to adjust my load, serenaded by roaring lorries, then slowly descended into the port. Here's a tip for all ports. Do what Dover does and paint a red line on the pavement for cyclists to follow. All you have to do is peer at the ground, find the red line, and it leads you like a piece of string, neatly bypassing trucks and coaches and cars and fences and gates and signs, and within 5 minutes I was at the border control, and within 7 minutes I was past that, picking up my ticket and riding to lane 198 for my ferry in the early morning gloaming. Bikes are awesome at queue busting. I must have ridden past dozens of coaches full of sleepy British kids off on skiing trips, and thank you to the person in the VW camper who let me go in front of them at the border crossing post. It was a choppy crossing, and several ashen-faced teenagers stared glumly into space as the boat wallowed up and down, but we were soon docked at Calais, where, despite being the first on the boat, I was the last off, because, for my own safety, the crew assured me, I wasn't allowed to ride out of the port alone. I had to wait for 20 minutes at the end of the boarding ramp. "For a voiture," said the chap who stopped me. I thought I was going to be given a lift out of the port, but no, just an escort van, which had to follow past a mile or two of chain link fence until I was out of the port proper. Never mind what you think of Calais from the news. It's nice. It's a smart, clean city with really rather good cycleways everywhere. And then I realised I was here. I was in France. I was cycling. I was ecstatic. Unlike my previous tours where I'd had to rely mostly on paper maps, I had a smartphone this time, which was sometimes useful, but Google Maps did take me on weird detours along muddy canal towpaths, so I reverted initially to OpenStreetMap's cycle layer, which is generally pretty good. My route took me along canals to St Omer, then along the R cycleway over canals with large barges plying up and down, through villages and towns, and eventually at about 7 p.m. to a gîte I'd booked. Day 2 began inauspiciously. Now I'd expected the shops to be closed on Sunday afternoon in France when I'd arrived, but on the following Monday morning, when I was very hungry, I was disappointed to find that both boulangeries in Trézène were shut. Grumbling about my weird ability to arrive when places were shut, I was saved by that most French of establishments, Lidl. The route south of Lille was horrible, with Google Maps again sending me astray, so I reverted to paper maps and my brain, which frankly worked a lot better. Then I did find a boulangerie and had a really healthy lunch of a pain au chocolat and another patisserie, and before late in the day I found myself riding in the sun through beautiful forests and long canal towpaths to camping Le Mont des Bruyères, which was a fine in a still, it's basically kind of winter kind of way. And the next day was when I began slowly to fall in love with Belgium, although admittedly it didn't start that well. I'd swooped away from the frosty campsite at around 9 a.m, aiming for the 10:30 train in Belgium just over the border, and it was an excellent start right up until I realised I'd left my battery pack charging at the campsite. I whizzed backwards for 15 minutes and then retraced my steps and arrived at the train station in Belgium just in time to watch the train pull out. And this is where I found that Belgian trains are cheap, at least compared to the UK. I was going for a 3-hour train journey, about 200 kilometres, into a principal city, and my ticket cost €24, and that included the bike. Late afternoon, I ended up in Liège train station, which incidentally is beautiful, a kaleidoscopic rainbow of coloured panels glowing in the late afternoon sun, and by tea time I was in Eupen and began riding up into the High Fan. This was superb. A tarmac cycle route with 0 cars, reasonable gradient, good signage, excellent scenery, peaceful forests. The only downside was the 400-metre climb over 2.5 hours before I reached Gehalterberg and my hotel, where again I discovered that the restaurant and every other eatery in the village was shut, although I did manage to blag a pizza from the closed pizzeria. The next morning was when I entered cycling paradise. Gehalterberg not only has an amazing mini-market, with a machine where you could buy a glass of chilled local white wine, and an excellent bakery, but outside the tourist office it even had a vending machine for bike inner tubes. And then I was onto a network of perfectly signed bike tracks, through beautiful sunlit forests, across burbling streams and through meadows, past picnic benches and lakes. It was stunning. Such was the next scenery for the next day or so, Peaceful off-road cycle tracks, well signed, with handy conditorei, that's a German bakery if you don't know, in most towns. Perfect cycling territory. The route took me through increasingly narrow valleys surrounded by tall mountains, past the rivers I'd come to see, until I finally reached the Rhine, which makes for fabulous riding, with boats, castles, and all sorts of interesting things to see as you gently mooch downstream. I'd only had an hour or two here, but it was still worth the journey. Much of the return journey was less eventful, as by then I was hastening homewards. I'd had an overnight in a place called Euskirchen, which was just a convenient town to stop in, but then climbed up again through the increasingly beautiful hills across the High Fans or Hoven back to Eupen, where I stayed at a friendly campsite called Mondragon, run by a Dutch family who'd just taken over, and in classic friendly Dutch style had a dozen or more friends renovating the place. They invited me for dinner. Thanks, guys. It was the next day that I again marvelled at Belgium. A walk-up fare from one side of to the other of an entire country, going via the capital, Brussels, without changing trains and with a bike, cost me just €28. It took 3 hours, and when I disembarked in Ostend, the smell of the sea was lovely. The route from Ostend to Dunkirk was a bit of a dash, as I wanted to get the ferry later that same day, so I whizzed along the promenade, scattering small children in my wake, and getting slightly waylaid near the French-Belgian border when Google Maps again tried to send me along several kilometres of beach. But I just made it, tired and happy, to the 4 p.m. ferry home. And I honestly marvel at this final day. I went from one side of the Belgium to the other, then managed to ride along about 45 miles of coastline, and got a ferry in a single day, spending a grand total of about £30. And that's when I realised, apart from the buzz of the ride and the memories and the slightly increased fitness, I think I'd probably learned most was that I should have taken the Brussels kink after all.
So there you go. Moral to the story, do not avoid Belgium. Thank you to Richard Jeffries. Thank you to Gavin McCulloch. Thank you to Dale Majors and to Cathryn Ramsden. And again, apologies for making you wait all this time before you appeared on the podcast. And that really is it. So thank you for listening. Don't forget to support the podcast, cyclingeurope.org/support. If you'd like to get in contact, cyclingeurope.org/contact. The next episode, number 75, will be out at some point during the summer, hopefully. So until then, thank you for listening. Thank you to Rob Ainsley for the music, as always, and happy cycling.